My name is Mark Lane. I'm a lawyer. I've been practicing law for 57 years now, which is a quarter of the history of the American judicial system. I tell that to my wife, and she gets very nervous when I say that. And I write books. And the first book I ever wrote was about the assassination of John Kennedy, called Rush to Judgment. I knew John Kennedy because when he ran for president in 1960, I was one of his two campaign managers for the New York City area. He came into the district, he endorsed me. I was running for the state legislature. I was elected to the state legislature. He was elected to the presidency. And I worked very closely with Bobby Kennedy in that campaign. Teddy was sort of a kid around, but we didn't pay much attention to him. He didn't seem to be very important. Teddy became, in my view, probably the greatest legislator in the history of America in terms of what he did when he was in the Senate for all of those years. I lived in Washington for 35 of those years, right across the street, and investigating the assassination. I knew John Kennedy. I was one of his two campaign managers for president for the New York City area. I ran for the state legislature that year in 1960. John Kennedy endorsed me. I worked closely with Bobby Kennedy in that campaign and had contact with him during the 3 years, with the administration during the 3 years John was in office. And I was a lawyer. I've been a lawyer now for 57 years. Then less, but still a lot of a large number of criminal cases I tried. I had a storefront office in East Harlem. My clients were basically black, Puerto Rican, and a lot of them had problems, and I represented them in courts. And when Kennedy was killed and they picked up Oswald at once, and this is crucial, people should remember this, the rush to judgment was not really what the Warren Commission did, and in months it decided not to study the matter but stay with its preconceptions. The rush to judgment was really the beginning by J. Edgar Hoover, who that day said Oswald did it and did it alone. Now, if all the shots came from one place, and if Oswald, the evidence showed, fired all the shots, and actually they did not come from one place, and Oswald probably didn't fire any shots, but even if it were true that he had fired all the shots, this is the President of the United States. A lot of people had reasons to kill him in their mind. They had those reasons. How can you rule out a conspiracy? Meaning, did anybody tell Oswald about it? Did anyone pay Oswald to do it? Even if he did all of the firing, which he didn't do. So how can you say the first day there was no conspiracy? You can if you start with the preconception that we're going to say Oswald did it alone and we don't care what the evidence shows. I've tried enough criminal cases, and now there's this language which has arisen. It's attached to me, but now anybody else, because I was the first one to raise these questions, but now everyone also does, calling us conspiracy theorists. I've tried cases all around the United States. The theorists for conspiracies of the United States government, U.S. Attorney's Office, are charging people right now, as we're sitting here, in various cities around the country with conspiracy to do this or conspiracy to do that. I'm often a lawyer who defends people charged with conspiracies. The conspiracy theorists are the government, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Attorney General. That's their business. That's what they do all the time. The people who believe that Oswald was the lone assassin are people who are coincidence theorists. They believe the two acts are completely unrelated. As you look through the evidence, there's no other explanation for these things, and you have to actually call upon the supernatural to try to understand the thinkings of the Warren Commission, to try to credit it, even then it's a stretch. So I heard Hoover say Oswald did it. I saw Oswald on television. It was a very interesting interview. He was not allowed to talk to the media, but as they led him from one room to another, surrounded by the police officers and FBI agents, who questioned him over a period of 48 hours, not every minute, but during a 48-hour period. And what did he say? Where's the tape recording? What did he say? Doesn't exist. Most important prisoner in the history of America. FBI questioned him. We don't know what he said, except we know when he went through the hallways and the press fired questions at him, He denied that he had anything to do with any crime, and he asked for a lawyer to come forward and represent him. No lawyer was allowed. Lawyers volunteered. No lawyer was allowed. Nazi war criminals charged with war crimes at Nuremberg, they were allowed to have lawyers. Lee Harvey Oswald, no lawyer, because they had to kill him before he spoke. Because if he were tried, we would know something about more than we do now, and certainly a lot more than we did back in 1964 and 5, about who killed President Kennedy. And one of the most interesting things as he went through the hallway, if you recall, he said, I emphatically deny these charges. I don't know what they're talking about. I didn't kill anybody. And a reporter said, did you kill the president? And he looked astonished. He'd been questioned for hours now. He said, the president? Nobody's asked me about that. What were they talking about? And someone said, well, you have been charged. And you saw this look on his face, like, and then in the background, you heard him sound the patsy as they walked away. That was the single most important witness, and we don't know anything about him because he was killed in the basement of the police and Dallas courts building by Jack Ruby, who the Warren Commission said had no contact with intelligence, but later we were able to get a document from the archives signed by J. Edgar Hoover saying Jack Ruby worked for the FBI in Dallas in various areas as a contact agent of the FBI. Before that, he worked for organized crime in Chicago and was responsible probably for the murder of a major trade union leader. I remember on November 22nd, I was trying a case in the courthouse in Manhattan. You see it on Law and Order all the time. Well, you don't see that one. You see the next building, which is the Supreme Court building. It looks more like a courthouse with columns and everything. That's what television tells you is the criminal court building. It's not. It's the one next door. And I was coming from the one next door and went to Chinatown, which is very close by, to have lunch. And after lunch, it was a break in the trial. After lunch, I started walking back to the courthouse, and people were gathered around radios listening. And I said, what happened? They said the president's been shot. I ran back to the courthouse, and I went to the press corps room, and Jack Roth, who was the New York Times reporter, was a friend of mine. He covered the criminal courts building. I said, what happened, Jack? And he said, he's dead. They're only saying now that he was wounded, but we have the report he's dead. I said, oh, God, I got a trial. So I ran up to see the judge and told him that and asked that the case be put off. He said, no, we're not putting anything off. We're trying the case. So the president's been killed. I said, nothing we can do about it. Let's get on with it. I said, I'd like a continuance. He said, okay, I'll continue this case if that's what you want. But I'm remanding your client to prison until we try it. So I had no choice. I tried the case. We won. But it was the end of the day, and I came walking down steps, probably the least informed person in America as to what had happened. All I knew was the president had been shot, and I didn't know if anybody had been arrested. And there was an elderly judge who I liked a lot, and he was walking down the steps, and as I started to pass him, he said, you think he did it? And I said, who? He said, Oswald. I said, Oswald? He said, where you been? I said, trying the case. I had no choice. He said, yeah, they say Oswald did it. And it was a book depository building behind the president. So I got a question for you. I said, what's that, Your Honor? He said, how did he shoot him from the front, from the back? And that's the question. The first question I heard about the case. And as you look into the evidence, there's no answer. He was shot. John Kennedy was shot from the front. You see the effect of the bullet on his head. Not only his head go backward, but brain material goes back and almost knocks a police officer off his motorbike who was to the left rear of the president. Walter Cronkite addressed that in his full 1 hour apologies for the Warren Commission, in which he said, yes, the law of physics would say ordinarily that would not happen in ordinary circumstances, but these were not ordinary circumstances. They were shooting at the President of the United States. The law of physics changed because of that. When I mentioned that at lectures, people laugh, but nobody was laughing when Walter Cronkite said it. Nobody was laughing in those days. People were terrified. In fact, when the New York Times published, of course, on the front page, the Warren Commission report's release, and everybody in America supported it, that you could find all the networks, New York Times, all the newspapers, everybody. There was one person mentioned in an article by Pete Keese, who's a really wonderful veteran reporter at the New York Times, said, on the other hand, there's Mark Lane in New York City, and he is raising questions about this. But I was the only one. It was kind of lonely at the beginning in 1963, 1964. But then a lot of people heard me speak, and a lot of those people heard me speak. It's amazing. Later conducted their own investigations. I could give you the names of a dozen. So cool. Went back to my office and started contacting people who I knew. The lawyer for the Fair Play for Cuba committee, who was a friend of mine in New York, because they said Oswald was a member of that committee. The lawyer was hiding out. He was a very distinguished, well-known lawyer. He was hiding out. I couldn't reach him. His office called someone else, and they said, we can't tell you where he is. He's not available. I said, I'm a friend of his, Mark Lane. Okay, we'll try to get word to him. And he called me later that day. And I said, you represent Fair Play for Cuba. He said, Mark, do you want to take it over? You want to be counsel? I said, no, I'm just trying to find out about Oswald. He said, I'm hiding out. This is a very dangerous time. If you weren't there at the time, you would think the lawyer was kind of nutty now. But within a couple of years, I had 250 death threats looking into this. It wasn't funny. And people were terrified. And as I said, I was the only one in the New York Times who was mentioned as anyone who had any questions at all. I read the New York Times as soon as it came out, see what the coverage was there. And I read the name of a woman named Jean Hill, who was a Dallas school teacher, and very close to the limousine when the president was shot. And I called her on the telephone. I just called her and told her who I was and I was interested. She said, okay, do you know what Dealey Plaza looks like? I said, I don't even know I've never been to Dallas. And she said, let me describe it. And then she described the scene, and she said, and to the president's right front was a grassy knoll with a wooden fence on it. I said, you mind if I make notes and tell my friends about it? She said, no, go ahead. In any event, she said that's where shots came from. She could have said a green hill. She could have said a rolling hill. She said grassy knoll. And I said that to people in the news media, and that became the name for the most inspected piece of real estate in America. And it wasn't, I never met her until 25 years later. At the 25th anniversary of the assassination, there was a conference in Dallas, and there she was. And we saw each other the first time, hugged each other. I said, do you know that you named it the Grassy Knoll? She said, no, I never knew that, but it's in Citizen's Dissent. When that book came out, I saw it for the first time. I said, oh. I said, well, you're the one who named it that. And she said, yeah. Even when they were calling it the Grassy Knoll, she said, I didn't know that you got that from me. In any event, that's where it began. And she raised, obviously, additional questions for me. And then when I was watching television, my sister and her husband had a small place in Peekskill, New York, and we were painting it. And I was on the ladder painting it and watching TV at the same time. Probably missed a few spots on the wall. When Oswald was brought out, Jack Ruby was there and killed him. And I said, this is impossible. This has got to be worse than we could ever have imagined. And I decided then I was going to look into this matter. Started raising funds, lecturing, contacting everybody I knew. Went down to Dallas, got there last day of December, last day of the year, 1963. Checked into a hotel. I think University of Texas was playing in the Cotton Bowl or something. People were shouting about the team. And driving up on the sidewalk, everybody appeared to be drunk. And I went to this little steakhouse, ordered a steak, and I said, I'd like a vodka martini. They said, no, this is a dry town. You can't get liquor. I said, everybody else asked, oh, you can go next door to the drugstore and buy a bottle, but you can't get a drink. So it became clear to me Dallas was not against alcohol. They were against moderation. And I went next door and bought a bottle. But then I spent time, and I started finding witnesses and talking to them and finding that they'd been threatened with death if they talked to anyone. I went back a little later with the film crew, and we filmed these witnesses. And one of them, I will never forget S.M. Holland up on the railroad bridge at the time, and I filmed him on the railroad bridge. He said the shots came from there. He said he had been a Dallas deputy sheriff. He owned rifles. He went hunting. He said, I know where sounds come from, shots come from. They came from that wooden fence right there on the grassy knoll. And everybody up on that bridge knew it. He said, I was there in a semi-official capacity because Dallas police said, if the car goes right into that bridge, people could throw something at them. So since you're Union Terminal anyway, would you make sure nobody does anything? He said, well, nobody threw anything from the bridge, but they killed him from that place. And we ran over there, and we could see mud footprints up on the 2x4s if someone had been standing there. And then people say, well, where'd they go? Well, this is interesting because Dallas police officers went charging up there, and they found two men back there. And those two men, it's all in the archives, it's all been published now. Those two men up there said, we're with the Secret Service. And they flashed their credentials and disappeared. But check the Secret Service roster that day. There was nobody there from the Secret Service. Everybody was around the car, running or in the car. Nobody was behind the wooden fence from the Secret Service. So there were two people there who claimed they were Secret Service and were not. And of course, the government never looked into that because they started with the presumption that Oswald did it alone. Yeah, I knew the editor of The Nation. He was a friend of mine. And every once in a while, he would say, Mark, would you come in? I want to pick your brain about something. I was doing different things. I was had a law office in East Harlem. I was active in civil rights. I was active with Mayor Wagner and making suggestions to him. He asked me to look into what we can do about the public housing crisis, what can we do about narcotics, and I would be coming up with programs, presenting them to him at Gracie Mansion where he lived. And Carrie McWilliams, the editor of The Nation, said, I'd like to pick your brain about a lot of these things. So once a month or so, he asked me to come in. And then I told him about this guy, John Harrington, an Irish lad in Yorkville, who knew a lot about the inside of the Democratic Party, how things worked, and was not in favor of it, but was part of it, and anxious one day to run against the leadership, which he did do and won. And he said, why don't you bring John in one time? So I went in, we met with John Harrington, and Carrie and I talked about internal Democratic problems with Carmine DeSapio, who was running the Democratic Party for organized crime, the mafia. And after the assassination, I sat down and wrote an article. I figured, well, Carrie's the guy. And so I prepared this long piece and called Carrie, and he said, how you doing, Mark? I said, fine. I said, because he was always saying to me, write something about what you're doing. And I said, I did it, Carrie. I wrote something for you. He said, great. What is it? I said, it raises questions about the Kennedy assassination. He said, don't bring it in. Don't tell anybody you wrote it, and certainly don't tell anybody who ever talked to me about it. And never talk with me about that subject ever again. I said, what? Why? He said, don't ever discuss this with me ever again. And when I called him later, a few months later, he was not in. Never talked to me again after that one conversation. And we had been pretty friendly. So I realized this was the outside of everything. Then I went to see Jimmy Wexler. Jimmy Wexler was a dear friend of mine. He was the editor of the New York Post. It's not the New York Post that it is now. It was liberal. It was a little flashy, but it was liberal. It was run by Dorothy Schiff. They were somewhat critical of J. Edgar Hoover, somewhat critical of Joe McCarthy. Doesn't sound like much now, but in those days it was a lot. And I went to see Jimmy Wexler, and I said, I have this piece. I don't trust the kind of thing for the Post. He said, what's it about? And I told him, he said, Mark, 2 Puerto Ricans 2 weeks ago were shot right there on the west side of Manhattan. That's the kind of thing you should be looking into, not the Kennedy assassination. I said, the families actually have retained me in that case, and I am doing that. But what's that got to do with the Kennedy assassination? He was just finding something else for me to do. And he said, he should not, no one will publish it. You should just forget about it. So word got out that I'd gone everywhere, and everybody said no. And I got a call from the editor of the National Guardian, which was, I think it was called the Guardian later, the first National Guardian. It was a left publication. It supported Henry Wallace in 1948, was a third party candidate, and I knew them. And the editor said, can you bring that in? I said, I don't want this to be started on the left. I'm trying to get a more central approach. And he said, Mark, are you engaged in red baiting now? And I said, the president's been killed. A lot of people have been interested in this. And I want the largest audience to consider this. I'm not talking about money. I'll told everybody I'll give it away, but I want it to be someplace in a publication where a lot of people will see it. He said, can you send it in anyway? Can we pick it up? We won't publish unless you give us permission. I said, sure, you can read it. So he got it and called me, said, we want to publish it. And I went back to see Jimmy Wexler. And I said, this is my quandary. And I told him what the situation was. He said, don't give it to them. I said, better to burn it than give it to the National Guardian? He said, yes. That decided me. I called the Guardian and said, publish it. And so they published it. And they published a special edition after that. Thousands and thousands of copies, all sold out. And was published in Europe. A guy named Buchanan, who's an American living in Paris, picked it up and wrote an article, basically the same thing I had written. And whenever there was a conference and we were both invited, he would never show up for fear that I would sort of sue him for copyright infringement. But I sent him a note one time. I said, listen, I don't know you, but I'm trying to get the word out. I don't care about who gets the credit. And go be to conferences with me. I'm not going to cross-examine you or ask you about that. And I promise, I'm happy that it's all getting out. So later on, there was a conference where we both attended, and I never raised the question of his sources, which were me. So it got really widely read. And then one day, I got a phone call from Oswald's mother, Marguerite Oswald. And she said, I read this piece you wrote about my son. I'd like you to represent his interests before the Warren Commission. And I said, you subscribe to the National Guardian? She said, no. It was sent to me by a woman named Shirley Martin in Oklahoma, Hominy, Oklahoma. I never heard of Shirley Martin. I never actually had heard of Hominy, Oklahoma, as a matter of fact. But I then, is that noise by this? So I said to Mrs. Oswald, do you read the National Guardian? You subscribe to the National Guardian? And she said, no. A woman named Shirley Martin from Hominy, Oklahoma, she sent it to me. Said I should read it and read about you. I'd never heard of Shirley Martin. Later, she became a friend. And I'd never heard of Hominy, Oklahoma, as a matter of fact. But she read it, as it turns out, thought Marguerite Oswald should see it. Sent it to her. Now, Marguerite Oswald asked me to come and represent her son's interests before the Warren Commission. And I went down to meet with her, and there was a reporter for the New York Times down there when I met to see her in Dallas, at a hotel in Dallas. And I said, if you want to talk to me about my representing you, if there's a reporter present, it's not a privileged conversation. She said, I don't care about it being privileged. I said, okay. And we talked, and I said, I can't represent your son's interests, but I can tell you, because I don't really know what happened, I can tell you I'll conduct an investigation. If he were my client and I found out that he was involved in the criminal aspect, I could not report that because he'd be my client, but he's not my client. And I'm telling you now, the terms are I'm going to report whatever I find. Is that okay? We put that in writing. She said, yes, she agreed to that. And she said, is there anything else I can do? I said, your son was killed in the Dallas Police and Courts building. I think you have a wrongful death action against the Dallas authorities, probably the federal authorities. And she said, would you take that case? I said, I can't. I'm not a member of the Texas Bar. But you can go to the Bar Association, the local Bar Association, the ABA, American Bar Association, the American Civil Liberties Union. Go to one of those groups and ask for an attorney, see if someone will represent you. Then we came back, and I began my work, and the New York Times ran a big article about that interview. And 2 days later, I got a call from the Bar Association of New York saying they were considering disbarment proceedings against me. And I said, what did I do? And they said, come in, we'll tell you. So I went in, and they gave me a letter and talked with me. They said I was soliciting a case, the wrongful death case. And I said, not only was I not soliciting it, but I said I couldn't represent her, and gave her the pathway to other lawyers, the American Bar Association, local Bar Association, ACLU, none of which I'm associated with in Dallas. They said, well, that wasn't in the article. I said, we were there for 3 hours. It is a one-column article. Well, did you write to the New York Times to protest the fact that that was not in there? I said, no, I'm not a newspaper writer. I was at a meeting. They were at a meeting, and they covered it, and they said nothing untrue. Of course, they left things out. It was 3 hours. In fact, that was the first accurate piece on the Warren Commission, related to the Warren Commission, that I'd ever read in the New York Times. I wasn't going to write a letter protesting the fact that they didn't have 20 pages in the New York Times devoted to that one meeting. And I said, and what else bothers you? They said, you spoke disparagingly about the Chief Justice of the United States. I said he was wrong. This is still America, right? Even if you're a lawyer, you have First Amendment rights, and people have spoken disparagingly against him in the past. I said, I think Gerald Ford, who's on the committee, wanted to have him impeached, as a matter of fact, and I don't think anybody tried to take his license away. What are you talking about? Well, they proceeded with this. They proceeded with action against me to remove my license for having doubted the Warren Commission report. And I went to see Ed Ennis, who's an old friend of mine. He was the Solicitor General of the United States under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and a wonderful man. And I went to see him, and he said, who was it? I told him, Bonamy was the name of this. He said, I know him. Young man, I know him. Let's go back. And we went back, and he said, you should be ashamed of yourself. The Bar Association should be ashamed of itself. I want this withdrawn. And they said, well, they would consider it. And that was in 1964. It's now 2008. They have not yet withdrawn the allegations. They haven't processed it, but they haven't withdrawn it. It's not on my mind a lot. Just when I'm interviewed, and it doesn't bother me at all. But it's just an indication of how outrageous the times were and how terrified everybody was. One perfect example. President's been killed. If Oswald were alive, there would be a trial. Everything at the trial would be brought forth. Everything. Openly and publicly, hopefully. That's the way the American judicial system is supposed to work. But he was killed. There was no trial. And all of the witnesses, all of their testimony was marked top secret. No one from the news media was ever allowed to be present, ever. Except I said, I'm not going to do that, because they called me twice as a witness. And I said, mine has to be open. They said, okay, but somehow nobody was ever allowed in. But theoretically, it was open. Where was the news media? Where was an editorial in the New York Times? Where was an editorial on CBS? I mean, try that today. Have some terrible major crime take place and tell all the news media you're not allowed to be present when the facts are being secured, and they will go insane. But not one word in all of the American news media saying, open up the hearings, let us see what takes place. But that's an indication of how monolithic this march was behind the Warren Commission. And in fact, we knew it from the beginning. We knew it was going to be like this, because J. Lee Rankin was chosen as general counsel of the Warren Commission, and he listed the 6 panels through which all of the evidence was going to come to the commission. We have set up 6 panels, and he listed them. One was, what did Oswald do on November 22nd? Oswald's background, Jack Ruby's background. Was the Secret Service effective that day? Thought we knew the answer to that one. The president was dead, and they were supposed to be protecting him. They had 6 panels. And when I went before the commission, I had suggested to them that really, if I had been running the investigation, I would have had a 7th panel. It would have been called something like, who killed the president? Because that was not one of the questions. They only had 6 panels, and they were getting information. If what did Oswald do on November 22nd was sufficient, that means they set up with the conclusion before in their framework before they began the investigation. And that's the way it began, and that's the way it ended. The presumption that Oswald was the lone assassin, they set it themselves as they set out their program and did everything to support that conclusion. There was no real investigation by the Warren Commission.
Can you talk a little bit about the official versions? So we have the Warren Commission, and we have all these subsequent official versions, jury verdicts, the Marchetti case, and
right. Okay, this is the record as we look back on it now. We have the Warren Commission, and that's not the official name. The official name is the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy. The president whose commission it was Lyndon B. Johnson, President Kennedy's successor, vice president at the time of the assassination. When Lyndon Johnson was questioned about the assassination by Walter Cronkite, it was in support of Lyndon Johnson's book, which had just come out. And when he was questioned about that, Cronkite thought, here's a buddy, there's no question about this, and let's talk about the Warren Commission report. And Lyndon Johnson said, I never believed that report. I always thought there was a conspiracy. That's on record. Now, they both had an opportunity to edit it, and they did edit it, and they took those remarks out. But present at the time of that interview was a reporter for the New York Times, and he published those words. So this is what Lyndon Johnson said. Nobody ever denied it. Very prominently published in the New York Times. So that's the president who appointed the commission. He didn't believe it. Lawyers for the commission later, when all the evidence came out in 1975 through the House Select Committee, and other evidence came out about how the FBI and the CIA had deliberately misled the Warren Commission. Lawyers for the commission said, our reports were incorrect, but it's the fault of the agencies which lied to us. We relied upon the FBI, the Dallas police, the CIA. They gave us misinformation. So now we have the Warren Commission report repudiated by the person who appointed them, by lawyers for the commission. Even some members of the commission were saying they had grave doubts now about the truthfulness of the Warren Commission report. What does the Warren Commission say? The Warren Commission report says that 3 shots were fired, all by Oswald from the book depository building. Actually, witnesses heard, some heard 5 shots, but there's forensic evidence showing that 5 shots were fired. The problem with 5 shots, or even 4 shots, is that the Mannlicher Carcano, which the Warren Commission claimed Oswald used, was a slow hand-operated bolt-action weapon. A bolt, no round in there, and in the hands of the fastest experts they could find, it was impossible to get 4 shots off in 5.6 seconds. If the weapon was fully loaded, then you have to have 2 interval periods. Each one is 2.3 seconds. That's without even aiming to get the and fire. So 4 shots could not have been fired. And so Arlen Specter and David Bellin, 2 young lawyers, came up with the idea of what we call the magic bullet theory. That's in my first book, Rush to Judgment. We have a chapter called The Magic Bullet Theory. And it's been known, I think, to almost all the critics since that time as the magic bullet, because it did things that no bullet could do. In order to explain all the wounds, you have to have this bullet do a lot of things. Hit the president in the back, leaving, as it exited, a wound in the throat, leaving an entrance wound in the throat as it exited. Hung out there in midair for about 1.6 seconds, if you look at the Zapruder film, and then saw Governor Connolly right in front, and then hit Governor Connolly, went to his back, came out of his chest, shattered his wrist, and ended up in his thigh. It was a magic bullet, and it's there, Commission Exhibit 399, unmarked, almost like a pristine bullet, if you see a picture of it after all of those collisions. Governor Connolly said it didn't happen that way. I have a film of him saying, no, the bullet that hit the president hit me. The Warren Commission said, well, he didn't really know because it struck him a glancing blow. It almost killed him. It went through his chest, shattered his wrist, ended up in his thigh. He noticed it. he made it quite clear. He noticed it. It wasn't a glancing shot that I didn't notice. So you have Governor Connolly in the car saying it's not true. You have all the eyewitnesses. You have the doctors at the Parkland Memorial Hospital. All of them, every one of them, saying the wound in the throat was a wound of entrance. There's just overwhelming evidence that that's so. And so the magic bullet never existed. It was a made-up ploy for the purpose of showing that 3 bullets could have done it when at least 4 were fired, and I think there's strong evidence that 5 were fired. That's the Warren Commission report. Since then, we've had the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I know about that. I formed an organization, the Citizens Commission of Inquiry. I moved to Washington for that purpose to try to get the Congress to investigate. And we got more than 100 members of Congress to sign a petition calling for it. And I traveled around the country. We got more than 1 million letters, telegrams, petitions to the Congress demanding that they do this. One of the biggest stumbling blocks in all of this stuff has always been Tip O'Neill. Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House from Massachusetts. And he decided that this should not be raised. It should not be raised. We did get it finally through the Congress, through the House. There was an investigation, and they concluded that in all probability President Kennedy was shot as a result of a conspiracy. That's now the official word of the United States government on that question. A side note that's interesting about Tip O'Neill: if you buy his book, Man of the House, which was published in 1989, long after it's over, he said he had dinner at Jimmy's Harborside restaurant in Boston. If you ever get to Boston, it's a great restaurant, good seafood restaurant. And he was there with Davy Powers and Kenny O'Donnell, 2 of the guys that were called the Irish Mafia, that called them by the Kennedy folks, the Irish Mafia, the people that surrounded John Kennedy. Kenny O'Donnell was the single most important person in the administration. Davy Powers was very, very important in the administration. And they were both in the follow-up car, in the car behind President Kennedy's car at the time of the assassination. And this is what Tip O'Neill says in his book in 1989. He said, we were having dinner, and I said, we started to talk about the assassination. And Kenny O'Donnell said, you know, those shots came from behind that fence on the hill. And Tip said, what? You told the Warren Commission the shots came from the book depository building. He said, yes, that's what the FBI told me to say, but it wasn't true, and I did say that. Tip said, I can't believe that. Then he said, I then turned to Davy Powers. I said, you too told him came from the book depository, right? He said, yeah, but Kenny's right. Shots came from behind the wooden fence. I knew it, and the FBI told me to lie about it, so I did. Okay, so they're the people, the witnesses close to the throne, lying about the death of the president. But look at the other people who are not involved in politics. Gene Hill, the school teachers, the Union Terminal Railroad workers, the housewives, the ordinary people who watched it and told the truth. Aquila Clemens, who saw an aspect of the Tippit killing, the officer killed later that day, said the Dallas police came to her house and threatened to kill her if she ever told anybody. And then she told me the story. And I said, but they threatened to kill you. She said, I don't know what they're going to do, but I know what's right. And so she told the story. Warren Commission said she didn't exist. Specifically said she doesn't exist. She's my film. You can see her. She existed. Not for them, but in reality. Not in their fantasy world. Then you take S.M. Holland on the railroad bridge. When the interview was over, I said, anybody tell you not to talk to me? He said, yes. I've been ordered not to talk to you. And this is a guy I thought I had probably very little in common with. He's an older guy. He's in Texas, does a deputy sheriff, does a lot of hunting. And I said, and I didn't understand why he talked to me. So I said, well, why did you let me film you and tell me what you saw? He said, when you see the president, your president, shot in the head and killed in the middle of America on a bright sunny day, and you can't tell the truth about that, then I say, let's give this country back to the Indians. And he paused and he said, if they'll have it. So that was like the ordinary people speaking, and their positions were just so clear. So we have the House Select Committee on Assassinations, in essence going to all the libraries of America and stamping the Warren Commission report void. It's not the government position anymore. And then we ended up with a trial, an actual trial in the United States District Court in Florida. Is that noise bothering you?
A little bit, but
We do. What is it, you know?
It's
And then, of course, there is the actual trial in the United States District Court in Florida, federal court. E. Howard Hunt, of course, is the Watergate burglar. He worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. And Hunt filed a lawsuit against a little national but small right-wing publication called The Spotlight, because that had published an article by Victor Marchetti. Marchetti was the highest-ranking officer of the CIA to leave the organization and write a book exposing the misconduct of the CIA. You may remember the book because it came out with a lot of blank spaces where the CIA had redacted information, some of which was really amusing when Marchetti told me about it. That's another story. But the article that was written in 1975 by Marchetti, which is, as you know, long after the assassination, because Spotlight wasn't interested in the assassination. They hadn't done anything. But they had the CIA, former CIA officer who wanted to write about it, so they published it. It basically said the CIA and E. Howard Hunt were involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. Hunt sued. I didn't know about the article. I didn't know Marchetti, and I didn't know anybody at the newspaper. I didn't know there was a newspaper, although it was published from an office just 10-minute walk from where I lived in Washington, but I didn't know them. And Hunt won, and he got a verdict of $650,000 plus costs. That would have put the newspaper out of business. They went to a good firm and appellate firm, and the case was reversed because the lawyer for Liberty Lobby and the lawyer for Hunt agreed to what the standard should be, and the judge just gave the instruction that they both agree to. And generally, if both sides agree, you don't get it reversed unless it's something called plain error. It's just so obvious. It's just so outrageous that nobody can agree to it. And by a 2-to-1 vote, the Court of Appeals said this is plain error. It was just the wrong standard. I mean, the standard is actual malice when you're dealing with a public figure, meaning that someone published it with knowledge that it was untrue or with reckless disregard for the facts. And that was not the standard that the judge read, because Hunt's lawyer and Liberty Lobby's lawyer had agreed upon a totally incorrect standard. And the case was sent back for the trial. Then Mr. Carto, Willis Carto, the editor and publisher of Spotlight, called me and said, "Could you come and talk about my case?" I said, "What case is that?" And he told me. So I went there, and he asked me to represent them. I said, "Well, in the last trial, your attorney raised the question of, we didn't do it on purpose, we're sorry, etc. I don't like that defense, and I'm not going to use it. So if that's your defense," he said, "What's your defense?" Truth. Truth is an absolute defense. But in order to establish that, I want to have your permission right at the outset to take depositions of everybody I think should be deposed. He said, "You got it." So I took depositions of Richard Helms, former director of the CIA, Stansfield Turner, former director of the CIA, David Phillips, who ran the Western Hemisphere for the CIA, G. Gordon Liddy, Watergate burglar, E. Howard Hunt, and on and on and on. It was just the most remarkable. For me, it was a holiday. I mean, there's all these people I always wanted to talk to. I knew they would never talk to me, but now they had to. And we talked about everything about the Kennedy assassination. They were quite historic depositions. And then there was a woman named Marita Lorenz. Now, Marita Lorenz worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. She also worked for a number of other government police agencies. I have all the documents to show that. And I met with her, and she said, "I can tell you what happened, but I will never testify because they'll kill me." I said, "Tell me, this is off the record. I will not repeat it without your permission. What is it?" She said, "I was sent," she was Castro's girlfriend, more than a girlfriend. Her father was the captain of a German luxury liner, which landed in Cuba and was there on January 1st, 1959, which was inconvenient for them because that's when Fidel Castro took over. Came into Havana shortly after there, and he boarded the ship just to say hello to everybody. He was the new leader, and he met Marita Lorenz, one of the most beautiful women you will ever meet in your life. And the photographs of at the time, he said, "Oh, would you like me to show you what Cuba is like?" The revolution had just been won, and there was organizing a government, but he had time to drive through the mountains with her for weeks and spend a lot of time with him. Later, she returned to the United States, and the CIA recruited her through misinformation they gave her to go back and kill Castro. And they gave her this poison, and she was supposed to take it there, and she said, "How am I going to get out?" No problem. She was recruited by Frank Sturgis, CIA operative killer for the CIA. And no problem, because after he's dead, you can give him, and then we'll meet you outside, and we'll get you out of the country. Didn't sound like that was going to work, but that wasn't her problem. She went there, and on the plane, she said, "I'm carrying this poison." They said, "You won't be searched because you're Fidel's friend." She took the poison, and she put it in cold cream in her makeup kit. And it turns out all dissolved, and because you could maybe drop a little poison into a drink, into a rum drink, but you couldn't put the cold cream in there with it and have anybody drink it. So she landed, and she then said, "I got to tell you something, Fidel. They sent me back here to kill you." He said, "You would never kill me." She said, "No, I know, but no." And then she left and came back and said she wasn't able to do it. And then they gave her other assignments, getting guns, sending things to anti-Castro forces. And she traveled around the country doing that with Sturgis and with others, anti-Castro Cubans whose names she gave. And then one day she was recruited for a new mission. She was in Miami, and they were going to go to Dallas in November 1963. What was the purpose? She was going to be a decoy. She'd be told the purpose when she got there. She said, "We went in the car, and there was a follow-up car. In that car was Jerry Patrick Hemming, who was a killer for the CIA, Frank Sturgis, a killer for the CIA, anti-Castro Cubans, and huge numbers of weapons with sights on them, and others." And they drove to Dallas, and when we got to Dallas, Eduardo came out and paid Frank the money that was required. It was a lot of money. I said, "Who's Eduardo?" She said, E. Howard Hunt. His code name was Eduardo. He was the paymaster for the assassination team. She said, "I didn't know it was going to be the assassination then, but I was beginning to think that's what it was. The president was coming there. What were we all doing there with these rifles?" And she said, "I said to Sturgis, I want to get out of here. I don't want to. This is different. This is not running guns. This is something else." And she left the day before assassination. She was on the plane. Later, of course, she heard that Kennedy had been killed. She was back in New York, and Sturgis came to see her later. He said, "You missed the big one." She said, "What did you do there?" I said, "You know what we did. We killed Kennedy. But it's all covered. Nothing will ever get out. It's all covered. The facts will never get out." And I was down in Florida after that, and I looked up Jerry Patrick Hemming for contact. And I was staying at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Florida. I won't forget this. And I said, "I'd like to talk to you." Marita had already gone public. I'll go to that in a moment at a trial, but this is now Jerry Patrick Hemming. And he said, "All right." I said, "Call me from the lobby. I don't want to meet him in my room. I have a lot of people around." And there's a knock on my door, and there's Jerry Patrick Hemming, who's huge. I mean, I'm 6 feet. He wasn't twice as big as me, but he was huge. Very tall, very broad. He said, "Okay, you're Mark Lane." I said, "Yeah, I'm Jerry." So Jerry, "Why don't we go for a little walk downstairs? It's such a nice evening." He said, "All right." I think he realized, I don't know if he was armed. He wouldn't have to have been if he wanted to kill me, I'm sure. Anyway, we walked around, and I said, "I want to tell you everything that Marita said." And I told him the whole thing. So the 2-car caravan, you were in it, and you guys killed President Kennedy. That's the short version. His was a little longer. He said, I said, is she right? He said, no. I said, the whole story's made up? He said, no, no. She's right about everything except one thing. She must have forgotten. It was a 3-car caravan. So here we have Sturgis telling Marita what it was, Hemming telling me that that is exactly what happened. He was involved in it. And now we have a trial. So the defense at the trial was going to be Marita, but she said she was never going to tell the story to anybody. And I would not be telling it to you unless I got her permission, obviously. And I promised I would not reveal it. And then I said, instead of going to Florida, we could take your deposition in New York and use that at the trial. She said, all right, but I'm not naming the Cubans, because if I name the Cubans, I will be killed. But will the other side be there? And she said, yes. And she said, well, I'm not going to do it. They can follow me. I said, no, we'll do it this way. I got a hotel room in a big business hotel across the street from Madison Square Garden. It's called Penn, established, kept on changing its name. And he was a real businessman hotel and a lot of activity. And I got a room. And I said, what will happen is I will have everybody in the room waiting. Then I will show up with you. We'll meet at a spot. I'll show up with you. You'll come into the room. You'll answer my questions and their questions. I will have some friends there, and they will make sure these guys stay in the room. And I leave with you. Make sure nobody's following us. You get into a taxi, and I'm sure that you're gone and you can't be found. Then I'll go back to the room and say, okay, guys, you can go home. And I'll get their consent in advance, and if not, even if we get it, I'll have guys that make sure that nobody follows you. And they won't even know the room until they come to the hotel, and then this is before cell phones. Come to the hotel and then ring up and then just call me, but that could be, and then we will bring him to the room. So it seemed like it was covered, and that's what we did. And that's where she told that story. And that story was then read, deposition, sworn statement, which is the way it happens often, but she was not available. So the sworn statement was read to the jury. Instead of having my own voice getting the question and answer, I asked the judge for permission to have a woman get on the stand. The jury will be told this is not Marita Oswald, but these are her words, and she's reading the words. So we did it in a much more dramatic fashion than just reading, a dull reading. And I asked the questions, and she read the answers, and the jury heard that. And that was a crucial part. Hunt responded by releasing the names of the Cubans who were in the car. When I told that to Marita, she said, okay, he released the names. Let me see the names. She said, that's right. That's who they were. So she confirmed that these anti-Castro Cubans were involved in the assassination. So the jury heard everything. The trial began with me looking at this jury of 12 people in this then new court building. And I said, I'm going to present evidence to you at this trial to show that the Central Intelligence Agency killed your president. And people who were in the jury were quite surprised. The forewoman, who was a very attractive woman, actually rolled her eyes like this. And I said, I can understand you can't accept that now, but you're going to be the only jury in America that has all the evidence. And the judges will decide what's relevant. You're going to decide what's truthful. And I trust you people. So the jury heard everything. We did our closing statements, and I said, I ask you for a verdict for the defendant in his paper against Mr. Hunt and for costs of this to be paid by Mr. Hunt to the defendant based upon your belief that the CIA killed President Kennedy, and you believe that. Juries out for a relatively short period of time, and then they came back and found for us unanimously. And then I didn't talk to the jurors. They all came downstairs. They were surrounded by the news media, and they, of course, focused on the forewoman as the one who given the verdict and who was very attractive. She was just perfect for the television. And she said, you may have noticed when this trial began and Mr. Lane said that the CIA killed President Kennedy that I rolled my eyes, and then I realized I should not have done that, but it certainly made it seem that I believed that it was impossible, and that's what I believed at that time. We're the only jury in America that's heard all of the facts in front of a judge to decide what's relevant. We decided what's true. The CIA killed the president, and and we call upon the government to do something about this now. She said, when this case began, I believed in mom, apple pie, and the American way, and now I believe in mom and apple pie. The government has a responsibility here. Basically, nobody published it, the story. When Hunt won the first case, which had nothing to do with the Kennedy assassination, because both sides were saying, no, it was wrong, we're sorry, but it had nothing to do with the merits of the evidence. It was a big story in the Washington Post, front page, and the jump page was like a half page of details. And now here's a case where the jury says the CIA killed President Kennedy, or at least accepts our theory in their vote, and the forewoman says that's what I believe, and others believe that too, and nothing's published. So I decided to write a book about it, Plausible Denial. Remember now, of course, when I first wrote Rush to Judgment, I had never written a book, so I can understand people having some concerns. Who knows them? Is it going to sell? It became the #1 best-selling book in America, New York Times, #1 best-selling book in America in the year 1966. The #1 best-selling New York Times paperback the following year. 23 other countries. It's now been the basis of plays and movies all around the world. 23 other countries have published this book. It's been published in the United States now and reprinted 3 or 4 times now. I've lost track. Police academies, some of them use it as the way to investigate a crime. Police academies using Rush to Judgment. Okay, so I made a lot of money from my publishers.
We have to stop.
Yeah.
We're out of tape. Or I'm sorry, we're out of film.
No.